Good evening. There is a small white bottle in your bathroom cabinet. It has been there so long you have stopped seeing it. It sits between the hand cream and the throat lozenges, pressed against the back wall, label turned slightly inward, and on that label is a circle. And inside that circle is a cross made from 5 repeating letters, B-A-Y-E-R, a mark so familiar, your eyes slide right past it because it means nothing dangerous. It means relief. It means the pill your mother pressed into your palm when the fever climbed too high. It means the tablet dissolved in water on the morning after a long night. It means safety. It means a century and a half of German precision, clinical trust, the quiet confidence of science placed in service of human comfort. The Bayer Cross is one of the most recognized symbols on earth. More recognized, some studies suggest, than most national flags. More recognized than almost any religious or political emblem. A simple thing, a circle, a name, 5 letters arranged into a cross. But that cross has been on other things. It was on the bottle of heroin that Bayer marketed globally in 1898 as a non-addictive cough medicine for children. The same cross, the same circle, the same reassuring geometry. Mothers uncorked it over kitchen sinks in England and America and Germany and poured measured doses into small mouths. Infants slept. Toddlers stopped coughing. The medicine worked beautifully because the medicine was one of the most powerful narcotics ever synthesized, and the children who were given it were becoming dependent on it before their parents understood what dependency looked like, because the company that made it had told the world it was safe. That was only the beginning, and if heroin had remained Bayer's darkest chapter, history would have forgotten them by now. This is the complete history of Bayer, and it is a story not of malice alone, but of something more unsettling. A story of how institutions learn to wear the language of healing as a kind of armor. How the same chemistry that relieves pain can be turned with minimal adjustment toward the manufacture of suffering on an industrial scale. Before we go further, if these quiet journeys into the darker corners of history bring you some peace at the end of your day, consider leaving a like and let me know in the comments where in the world you are tonight and what time it is where you rest. But for now, dim the lights a little more, settle in, and let us begin. To understand what Bayer became, you have to understand what it started as. And what it started as was entirely unremarkable. The year is 1863. Germany does not yet exist as a unified nation. That would not come until 1871, when Bismarck's wars and political maneuvers finally forged the scattered German states into something resembling a country. What exists in 1863 is a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies and free cities, all of them changing fast, all of them being reshaped by the great industrial forces that are tearing the old European order apart and replacing it with smoke and iron and velocity. In the Wupper Valley, in the small industrial town of Barmen, a place that today forms part of the city of Wuppertal, the transformation is already well underway. The Wupper River runs dark. The air above the valley is thick with the residue of coal fires, the acrid sweetness of chemical works, the constant low thunder of textile mills running around the clock to meet the demands of a world that wants more cloth, more color, more of everything. The natural landscape that once gave the valley its character, the wooded hills, the clear running water, the quiet meadows that German romantic poets had celebrated a generation earlier, is disappearing beneath brick and iron, swallowed by the appetite of the new age. it is into this world that Friedrich Bayer arrives. He is 38 years old in 1863, and he has been in the trade of chemicals and dyes for most of his working life. He is not a scientist. He is a salesman, precise, commercially minded, with a temperament calibrated entirely toward profit and opportunity. There is something worth noting about Friedrich Bayer from the start. His name is not originally Bayer. He was born Friedrich Bayer with an E. He changed the spelling deliberately in his 20s to distance himself from a disreputable merchant in Leipzig who shared his original surname, a small vanity or perhaps a practical calculation that a name, properly managed, is itself a kind of product, and a damaged name is a damaged business. He understood even then that perception and reality were not always the same thing, and that the gap between them could be managed. His partner is Johann Friedrich Westcott. Where Bayer is the commercial mind, Westcott is the technical one, a master dyer by training, a man who understands chemistry, not as abstract theory, but as something you perform with your hands, overheat with volatile materials that produce color and smell, and, if you are careless, small explosions. They have been experimenting together, reportedly on kitchen stoves, with the new synthetic coal tar dyes that British chemists had begun developing in the late 1850s. The first of these synthetic dyes, Movane, an accidental discovery by an 18-year-old English student named William Perkin in 1856, had opened an entire new commercial universe. Before Perkin's discovery, color came from natural sources: indigo from plants, crimson from insects, purple from mollusks. These natural dyes were expensive, inconsistent, and slow to produce. Synthetic dyes were none of these things. They were bright, reproducible, and could be manufactured in industrial quantities from coal tar, the dark waste product of gasworks that most cities were already producing in abundance and struggling to dispose of. Bayer and Westcott understand the opportunity. Their compound, fuchsin, a vivid magenta, is commercially viable. The textile industry needs it. The market is enormous. On the first day of August, 1863, they formalized their partnership as Frieder, Bayer et Comp, and the company that will one day be the most powerful pharmaceutical corporation on earth begins its life as a small dye shop in the Wupper Valley, making colored powder for fabric. There is nothing sinister in this at the outset. Bayer and Westcott are tradesmen in a period of extraordinary commercial expansion. They are doing what thousands of small industrial enterprises across Germany and Britain and France are doing: finding a chemical process that works, building a business around it, trying to grow before a competitor undercuts them. For the first decade, the company is a successful but modest operation. They moved their headquarters to nearby Elberfeld in 1866, acquiring larger premises to accommodate growing production. They export across Europe. Friedrich Bayer himself travels constantly, maintaining distribution networks in London and Brussels and St. Petersburg, and even as far as New York, because the synthetic dye market is international from the beginning. Color, it turns out, is something that all industrializing nations want in roughly equal measure. Both founders are also, in their different ways, limited by what they are. Friedrich Bayer is a merchant who became a manufacturer, and his instincts are commercial rather than scientific. Westcott is a craftsman whose knowledge of chemistry, though practical and sophisticated, is rooted in older traditions of the dyeing trade rather than in the new experimental science being developed in the German universities. And it is the German universities in this period that are producing something that will transform the global chemical industry. A generation of rigorously trained research chemists who understand organic chemistry at a molecular level and can apply that understanding to the systematic development of new compounds. The company begins to grasp this early. It establishes relationships with university researchers and begins tentatively to build its own research capacity. But it is not until 1883 that the figure arrives who will truly reshape Bayer's destiny. Not just as a chemical company, but as a pharmaceutical one, and eventually as something far darker. His name is Karl Duisberg. He is 22 years old when he joins Bayer, fresh from his doctoral studies in chemistry, and he is immediately marked as exceptional. Where Friedrich Bayer was a salesman and Westcott a craftsman, Duisberg is something new. A scientist with the ambitions of an industrialist, a man who thinks not in terms of the next product or the next export contract, but in terms of systems, structures, monopolies, the long-range architecture of economic power. He understands, in a way his employers only partially grasp, that the real value in organic chemistry is not any single compound, but the research infrastructure that generates compounds continuously. The laboratory as a perpetual discovery machine, producing new products faster than competitors can copy them. Under Duisberg, Bayer begins to transform. A major research laboratory is established at the Elberfeld site in 1891, equipped at a scale that few industrial facilities anywhere in the world can match at this point. The laboratory is not merely a place where chemicals are tested. It is a place where organic molecules are systematically modified, acetylated, brominated, nitrated, combined in novel configurations to produce new substances with new physiological effects. Bayer's first pharmaceutical product, the fever-reducing compound phenacetin, is launched in 1887. Then come more medicines, then more still. 48 drugs introduced between 1887 and 1902 alone. The dye company is becoming a pharmaceutical company, and the pharmaceutical company is becoming something that has never quite existed before. A corporation whose primary product is the discovery itself. Friedrich Bayer does not live to see this. He dies in 1880 at 54, still traveling, still managing his distribution networks, still the commercial salesman he has always been, apparently unaware that the company bearing his altered name is about to become something he could not have imagined. Johann Friedrich Westcott has already been dead for 4 years by then, taken by illness in 1876. The two men who founded the company depart before its most consequential chapter begins. The company outlives them, grows past them, and becomes, as institutions so often do, something its founders could neither have intended nor controlled. Duisberg rises. By 1900, he is Bayer's managing director, its most powerful figure, the man who determines its direction and ambition, and ultimately its moral character. He is brilliant by every account, analytically precise, strategically visionary, possessed of an extraordinary grasp of both the science and the commerce of the chemical industry. He is also a man who understands power as an end in itself, who sees no contradiction between the language of science and the logic of domination, who will, in time, build the largest corporate entity in German history and use it to fund the rise of a movement that will set the world on fire. But in 1883, he is 22, newly arrived, and the laboratory in Elberfeld is just beginning to glow late into the nights with the work of young chemists adding acetyl groups to molecule after molecule, testing the results, recording the outcomes in precise laboratory notebooks, searching, as they will search for years, for the next compound, the next product, the next discovery. In the summer of 1897, one of those chemists will find two of them in 11 days, and nothing, anywhere, will ever quite be the same. Let us stay a moment with that laboratory, with what it means that it exists at all. There is a tendency, when looking backward at history, to treat institutions as though they had intentions, as though a company is a kind of person capable of choosing its own arc, planning its own trajectory. This is a simplification. Companies are structures, legal structures, financial structures, and what they do at any given moment reflects not some singular dark will, but the convergence of many smaller decisions, each made by individuals responding to incentives and pressures and possibilities that their predecessors could not have anticipated. What Bayer does in 1897 with the compounds discovered in its Elberfeld laboratory is not the fulfillment of some founding vision. Friedrich Bayer wanted to sell dye. What emerged was the consequence of decades of institutional evolution driven by market pressure, scientific ambition, and the particular genius of Duisburg for building systems that generate new products faster than anyone on earth. And yet the pattern, once you see it, is difficult to unsee. Because what Bayer does with its discoveries in 1897, and what it does with them in the years that follow, and what the corporate entity that absorbs Bayer in 1925 does in the 1930s and 1940s, all of this shares a logic. The logic of the laboratory unconstrained by the uses to which its findings will be put. The logic of the corporation that measures success in revenue and does not build moral calculation into its assessment of whether a product should exist. The logic that says this compound works, this compound can be sold, therefore this compound will be made available, and whatever happens after that is not our responsibility. This logic does not begin with the worst thing Bayer ever does. It begins here, quietly, in 1891, in the construction of a research laboratory whose output will not be examined with moral seriousness for another 50 years, by which time the consequences of not examining it will be counted in the millions. The laboratory opens, the chemists arrive. They are young, educated, and extraordinarily capable. They wear white coats in a building that smells of reagents and coal, and the faint organic sweetness of complex carbon compounds being assembled in configurations that nature never arrived at on its own. They write in careful notebooks, they follow protocols, they report their findings up a chain of command that terminates, ultimately, in Duisburg, who is simultaneously thinking about the science and the market and the competition and the long-range positioning of the company against BASF and Höchst and the British and the Americans, all of them also trying, in their different ways, to turn chemistry into money. The chemists do not, for the most part, ask what their discoveries will be used for. They ask whether the compound works, whether the molecule does what it is expected to do, whether it can be manufactured reliably and at scale, whether it can be patented and sold. These are the right questions if all you are trying to do is run a pharmaceutical company. They are, however, incomplete questions if you are also trying to account for what happens when the power to reshape human biochemistry is placed in the hands of an institution with no mechanism for moral restraint. In the summer of 1897, a young chemist is working in that laboratory. His name is Felix Hoffmann. He is 30 years old. His father suffers from crippling arthritis, and this personal grief has sharpened his desire to find something that genuinely helps people in pain. A motivation that is entirely sympathetic, entirely human, and important to hold as we move forward. Because what follows is not a story of villains in the simple sense. It is a story of capable people operating inside a structure that will repeatedly make it possible to do terrible things while believing, with complete sincerity, that they are doing science. Hoffmann has been assigned to a methodical project, adding an acetyl group to various organic molecules to reduce their toxicity or improve their clinical effect, one molecule after another. Testing, recording, a slow, systematic search through chemical space for something useful. On the 10th day of August, 1897, he stabilizes acetyl salicylic acid in a pure, consistent form. The first true aspirin, clean, effective. He records the discovery in his laboratory notebook and reports it through the appropriate channels. 11 days later, on the 21st of August, still at the same bench, still using the same method, Hoffmann synthesizes diacetylmorphine. He calls it nothing. He simply records what he has made. The company will name it the following year, from the German word for heroic. Heroin. One laboratory, one chemist, one method, 11 days. The world's most beneficial medicine and the world's most destructive narcotic, born from the same hands, recorded in the same notebook, on the same laboratory bench in Elberfeld in the summer of 1897. The next chapter of this story belongs to the men who decided what to do with both of them. The notebook still exists. It sits in Bayer's corporate archive in Leverkusen, a slim volume of careful German handwriting, the kind of precision penmanship that educated men of the late 19th century were trained from childhood to produce. The entries are methodical: dates, compound names, observed properties, reaction conditions. The language is the language of science. Neutral, descriptive, stripped of interpretation. A record of what was done, not of what it meant. On the page for the 10th of August, 1897, there is an entry for acetyl salicylic acid. The notation records a successful synthesis, a stable crystalline form, purity confirmed. The entry is not marked as significant. It does not announce itself as the birth of the most widely consumed medicine in human history. It is simply a record of work completed, one entry among many in a methodical summer's research. 11 days later, on the 21st of August, there is an entry for diacetylmorphine. Same notebook, same handwriting, same methodical neutrality. Work completed, compound noted. The entry does not announce that this substance will be sold to mothers as a children's cough remedy, that it will addict millions, that it will be given the brand name by which the entire world still knows it. It is simply there, in the same ink, on the facing page, as though the two discoveries were of equal weight and equal consequence, which, at the moment of their recording, they appeared to be. Felix Hoffmann wrote both entries. He was 30 years old. He had been at Bayer since 1894. Let us take a moment with him, because he is the most human figure in this story, the most sympathetic, and in some ways the most tragic. And understanding him properly is essential to understanding how the events of August 1897 were possible. Felix Hoffmann was not a cynical man. He was not, as far as any historical record shows, a greedy one. He was a chemist who wanted to find things that helped people, and he had, in the figure of his father, a daily reminder of what pain looked like when medicine failed to address it. Hermann Hoffmann suffered from severe arthritis. His joints ached with a constancy and intensity that made ordinary life genuinely difficult, and the available treatments, salicylic acid derivatives principally, upset the stomach so severely that patients often found the remedy worse than the condition. Felix Hoffmann wanted with real sincerity to fix this, to find a version of the medicine that worked without the gastric misery that accompanied it. He found it on August 10th, 1897. The method he used was acetylation, the process of adding an acetyl group, a small molecular cluster of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, to an existing compound to modify its properties. This was not a new idea. It was not even a new idea at Bayer. The company's first pharmaceutical success, phenacetin, had been produced by a similar acetylation strategy a decade earlier. What Hoffmann achieved was the stable, pure synthesis of a compound, acetyl salicylic acid, that had technically been made before by a French chemist named Charles Frederick Gerhardt in 1853, but had never been produced in a form sufficiently pure and stable to be clinically useful. Gerhardt's version degraded quickly and caused significant irritation. Hoffmann's version was different. It was clean. It held its form. It worked. He reported the discovery. It moved through Bayer's internal system to Heinrich Dresser, who was the head of the company's pharmacological laboratory, the man responsible for evaluating new compounds and deciding which ones were worth pursuing commercially. And here, the story takes its first strange turn, because Dresser's initial reaction to acetyl salicylic acid was largely dismissive. He considered it a compound with modest clinical potential and significant cardiac risks, based on his preliminary assessment, and he was not inclined to invest resources in developing it further. The compound sat, essentially shelved, while Dresser turned his attention elsewhere. That elsewhere was diacetyl morphine. The compound Hoffmann synthesized 11 days later was not, strictly speaking, an original discovery. An English chemist named Charles Romilly, Alder Wright, had synthesized diacetyl morphine in 1874, working at St. Mary's Hospital in London, in an attempt to find a less addictive form of morphine. Wright had boiled morphine on his stove with acetic anhydride and produced the compound, noted its properties, found them uninteresting for his purposes, and largely set the work aside. The discovery had been published. It was not a secret. Bayer's Heinrich Dresser was aware of it. What Hoffmann contributed, as he had with aspirin, was a cleaner, more stable synthesis. A version of the compound that could be reliably reproduced and potentially manufactured at scale. Dresser's response to diacetyl morphine was the opposite of his response to aspirin. He was immediately and intensely interested. He saw commercial potential in this compound that he had failed to see in the other, and the reason was straightforward. The medical problem that diacetyl morphine appeared to solve was one of the most pressing therapeutic challenges of the late 19th century. Morphine was everywhere. It had been isolated from opium in the early 1800s, and by the latter decades of the century, it was one of the most commonly used medicines in the world. A powerful painkiller and cough suppressant prescribed for everything from post-surgical pain to tuberculosis to the ordinary respiratory infections that killed enormous numbers of people in an era before antibiotics. The problem was that morphine was also deeply, destructively addictive. Soldiers who had received it during the American Civil War had returned home dependent on it. Housewives who had been prescribed it for menstrual pain were finding they could not stop. The medical profession was acutely aware of the morphine problem by the 1890s, and there was intense commercial and clinical demand for a substitute, something that would provide the therapeutic benefits of morphine without the dependency that came with it. Diacetylmorphine, Dreiser believed, was that substitute. The compound was, in his preliminary assessment, more effective than morphine as a painkiller and cough suppressant, and appeared to produce less of the drowsiness and dependency associated with its predecessor. This assessment was based on tests conducted on animals, primarily frogs and rabbits, and then in a practice that would raise significant ethical questions today, but was relatively standard at the time, on human subjects including Bayer's own workers and Dreiser himself. The workers, when given diacetylmorphine, reported that they felt a remarkable sensation, strong, capable, almost invincible. In German, the word is heroisch, heroic. The company had its brand name. In the autumn of 1898, Bayer presented its new compound to the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians. The presentation was made by Dreiser, and it was not modest in its claims. He described diacetylmorphine, now officially named heroin, as a compound with therapeutic properties 10 times superior to those of codeine as a cough suppressant, more effective than morphine as a painkiller, and crucially, in the word that would echo through the disaster that followed, non-addictive, not dependency-forming, safe for extended use. A medicine that provided the clinical benefits of its predecessors without the devastating social cost. The medical world received this claim with something close to relief. Morphine addiction was a serious, visible, socially costly problem. The idea that a pharmaceutical company had solved it, had engineered a compound that did what morphine did without making patients dependent, was exactly the kind of scientific breakthrough that late 19th century medicine was predisposed to believe in. The era was one of genuine pharmaceutical miracles. Organic chemistry was producing new medicines at a rate that seemed to the people living through it almost magical. Aspirin itself, when it was eventually launched a year later in 1899, was a genuine miracle. A stable, effective, safe anti-inflammatory and fever reducer that was dramatically better than anything previously available. The confidence in pharmaceutical science was, given the real achievements of pharmaceutical science, entirely reasonable. And so the doctors believed Dreiser. Before we go further, there is a shadow over the story of aspirin's discovery that deserves a moment of attention. A shadow that the company did not fully reckon with for nearly half a century, and that connects the story of Bayer's science to the broader history of what the institution would do, again and again, when its interests conflicted with inconvenient truths. The shadow is Arthur Eichengrun. Arthur Eichengrun was a chemist at Bayer in 1897, and he was, by his own later account, more than a peripheral figure in the development of aspirin. He claimed, in a paper published in 1949, that he had been the one to direct Hoffmann's synthesis of acetyl salicylic acid, that the project was his, that he had recognized its potential when Dreiser had dismissed it, and that he had arranged for clinical trials of the compound to be conducted without Dreiser's knowledge or approval, effectively circumventing his superior to bring a drug he believed in to market. Eichengrun's account has been examined seriously by historians, and a paper published in the British Medical Journal in 2000 concluded that his version of events was consistent with the available historical evidence, and that Bayer's attribution of Aspirin's discovery solely to Felix Hoffmann was questionable. The reason this matters, beyond the historical question of who deserves credit for what, is the context in which Eichengren's name was erased from the company's records. Arthur Eichengren was Jewish. The erasure occurred after the National Socialist government came to power in Germany and began its systematic removal of Jewish contributions from the official record of German cultural and scientific achievement. Bayer did not resist this erasure. Bayer accommodated it. The company that would profit for over a century from aspirin, that would celebrate its centenary in 1999 by wrapping its Leverkusen headquarters in the world's largest aspirin packet, chose at a critical moment to allow the contribution of the man who may have made that drug possible to be written out of the story because of who he was. Eichengren was arrested in 1944 and sent to Theresienstadt concentration camp. He survived. He was 77 years old when he published his account. Bayer never formally acknowledged it. This is where we are in the story, and it is worth pausing to note what has accumulated already. A pharmaceutical company that will become globally trusted for healing has, by 1898, synthesized the world's most addictive narcotic and decided to brand it, market it, and sell it under the claim that it is safe. It has, along the way, potentially erased the contributions of a Jewish scientist in deference to a political movement it will soon be actively funding. And it has done all of this while simultaneously developing aspirin, genuinely developing one of the greatest medicines in human history, a compound that will save millions of lives and relieve incalculable amounts of suffering. Both things are true, simultaneously. This is not a simple story. By 1899, Bayer is producing 1 ton of heroin per year. It is selling the drug in 23 countries. The Bayer cross appears on every bottle. Heroin is available in tablets, in glycerin elixirs, in water-soluble salts, in cough syrups that mothers can purchase without a prescription in pharmacies across Europe and North America and beyond. Physicians prescribe it for tuberculosis, for bronchitis, for asthma, for the ordinary winter coughs of children. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal in 1900 publishes an endorsement that captures the medical consensus of the moment. It possesses many advantages over morphine, the journal declares. There is no danger of acquiring a habit, no danger of acquiring a habit. The danger, as it turned out, was simply slower to appear than Drieser's animal tests had suggested. Diacetylmorphine crosses the blood-brain barrier more rapidly than morphine. It is, in fact, a more efficient delivery mechanism for the same opioid compounds that make morphine addictive. The dependency it produced was not lesser than morphine's. It was, in many cases, greater, and it was also faster. Patients who had been prescribed heroin for coughs began returning to their physicians for more, with an insistence and urgency that some doctors found troubling. Reports began to surface within months of heroin's widespread availability, of patients who seemed unable to stop. German physician E. Strecker published observations of dependency symptoms in 1899. The same year aspirin launched, the same year Bayer was cranking out a ton of heroin annually for sale in 24 countries. These reports were noted. They were not acted upon. The commercial momentum was too great, the investment too substantial, the initial medical endorsements too enthusiastic, and the dependency effects too gradual to produce an immediate crisis. Bayer continued. The story of what happened next, to the patients, to the children, to the households in which Bayer's heroin cough syrup became a quiet fixture, belongs to the next chapter. But before we leave August 1897 and the laboratory in Elberfeld, it is worth sitting with one final image. Felix Hoffmann retired from Bayer in 1928. He moved to Switzerland. He lived quietly, out of the public eye, largely unknown. He died in 1946 at 78, having never been widely recognized for either of the discoveries that came from his hands in that summer of 1897. The aspirin he had made was already one of the most profitable products in pharmaceutical history. The heroin he had made had already been banned in most countries, had already produced addiction on a global scale, had already written its consequences in lives altered and shortened and ended. He had simply been doing his work, adding acetyl groups to molecules, recording the outcomes in a careful hand. The notebook is still in the archive. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific architecture of that medical endorsement, in the way scientific authority sincerely offered became the mechanism by which an addictive narcotic was delivered to children across the world. The physicians who endorsed heroin in 1898 and 1899 were not corrupt. They were not in Bayer's pay, for the most part. They were doctors who looked at the available evidence, evaluated it through the methods available to them, and reached a conclusion that the evidence at that moment appeared to support. Drieser's animal tests were real. The reports from Bayer workers were real. The Congress presentation was conducted in good faith by a man who genuinely believed his compound was safer than what it replaced. This is the mechanism. Not deliberate deception at the outset, though what followed would make deception unavoidable. At the outset, it is something more unsettling. Sincere belief in a claim that was incomplete, married to commercial incentive to stop asking questions once the claim had been made. The compound has been named. The drug has been launched. The doctors are prescribing it. The revenue is climbing. Each of those facts makes the next question harder to ask, and each month that passes without a crisis provides fresh evidence for those who want it that the crisis will not come until it does. Aspirin, in the same period, is quietly becoming the compound it will remain for the next century. It is launched in 1899, initially as a powder supplied in glass bottles to physicians. By 1915, Bayer has begun producing aspirin tablets stamped with the Bayer cross. The company's logo pressed directly into the medicine, brand identity made physical. The cross is on every tablet. The cross is on every bottle of cough syrup laced with heroin. One cross, two drugs, two completely different fates. The aspirin business grows steadily, carefully, on the strength of a product that does exactly what it says it does and does no harm. The heroin business grows faster, explosively, and then contracts in the ugliest possible way, when the truth of what the drug does becomes too widespread to ignore. By 1913, Bayer quietly stops producing heroin, not because of a moral reckoning, not because of an internal review that concluded the company had been wrong, but because the regulatory pressure is mounting. The addiction crisis is visible enough to have become a political problem, and the market Bayer had built on heroin is about to be legislated away. In the United States, with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, and in country after country thereafter. Bayer moves on. The addicts remain. The children who had been given heroin cough syrup as toddlers are older now, and some of them are not well. and none of them received a letter from the company that made the medicine their mothers had trusted. Picture a kitchen in 1901. It could be in Manchester or Munich or Milwaukee. The details change. The curtain pattern, the color of the tiles, the shape of the stove. But the essential scene is the same across the industrialized world in the first years of the 20th century. A child is coughing. It is winter, and winter in this period means something that winter no longer quite means. It means tuberculosis moving quietly through tenement buildings. It means bronchitis settling into the chests of children who have spent their days in damp schoolrooms or cold factories. It means the dry, persistent cough that a mother cannot ignore because she has seen or known someone who has seen what an ignored cough can become. She opens the medicine cabinet. She takes out a small brown bottle. On the label, printed in the clean, authoritative typeface that pharmaceutical companies had already learned to associate with scientific credibility, is the name of the product and the name of the company. The bottle contains a cough syrup. The company is Bayer. The active ingredient is heroin. She measures a dose. She gives it to her child. The child stops coughing. The child grows calm. The child sleeps. This is the world that Bayer's marketing campaign created. Not through fraud in the crude sense, not through falsified data or deliberate misrepresentation at the point of sale, but through something more structurally insidious, the construction of a medical consensus that was sincere when it was formed and catastrophically wrong, distributed through the trusted networks of professional medicine into the hands of people who had every reason to believe that what they were being given was safe because the people giving it to them believed the same thing. The scale of Bayer's heroin distribution in the years between 1898 and 1913 is difficult to fully comprehend in the present, when the word heroin carries the accumulated weight of a century of drug crises, overdoses, and social devastation. In 1898, heroin was a new pharmaceutical product from a company that had recently demonstrated it could produce genuinely beneficial medicines. In 1898, trusting a bottle of Bayer heroin cough syrup was not an act of negligence. It was an act of faith in pharmaceutical science, the same faith that, in the same period, was entirely justified when applied to aspirin. Within a year of its commercial launch, heroin was being sold in 23 countries. Bayer was producing 1 ton of the drug annually. The company distributed free samples to physicians across Europe and North America, a practice that was standard in the pharmaceutical industry and perfectly legal, and the physicians who received those samples prescribed the drug to their patients with confidence because the company that made it had told them it was safe, and the Congress of German Naturalists and Physicians had endorsed that assessment, and there was no obvious reason in 1899 to doubt either source. The forms in which heroin was available were remarkably varied. There were tablets, small, white, pressed into the same disc shape that pharmaceutical tablets still take today. There were water-soluble heroin salts that could be dissolved and injected, sold in kits that came with a syringe, available in pharmacies across Europe. There were glycerin elixirs, and there were cough syrups, the domestic formulation, the one designed for household use, the one a mother could purchase over the counter and keep in the medicine cabinet and administer to a coughing child without a prescription, without a physician's approval, without any barrier at all between the product and the small body that would receive it. The indications for which heroin was prescribed and self-administered spread rapidly beyond respiratory illness. Physicians found that it worked for pain. Of course it did. It was an opioid. and they began prescribing it for headaches, for menstrual discomfort, for the general category of suffering that medicine in this period addressed with whatever powerful sedative was most readily available. Elderly patients received it for pneumonia. Women received it for what contemporaries called nervous disorders. Men returning from work in the mines or the mills with bodies that ached from physical labor found that a few doses of bioheroin made the evenings bearable. During the First World War, British women could order a special hamper from Harrods, the famous London department store, containing a supply of heroin to send to soldiers at the front. This was not black market commerce, it was retail. It was a gift appropriate for a loved one in difficult circumstances, available in a luxury shop, packaged for posting to the trenches. The dependency arrived gradually, because that is how opioid dependency arrives. It does not announce itself. It disguises itself at first as the natural desire to feel better, the same desire that motivates the taking of any medicine. A person who has taken heroin for coughs finds that when the cough resolves, there is a different kind of discomfort, a restlessness, an irritability, a sense of something missing that is not quite pain but resembles pain closely enough that reaching for the bottle again feels like medical necessity rather than compulsion. The bottle provides relief. The relief lasts. The dose that provided relief last week provides slightly less relief this week. The body has adapted. More is needed. This is the pharmacology of opioid addiction, and it operates in the same way in 1901 as it does today. The molecule does not care whether it is called morphine or heroin or oxycodone. It does not care whether the person receiving it is a soldier or a housewife or a child. It binds to the same receptors, produces the same effects, creates the same dependency through the same neurological mechanism. What changes across time is not the chemistry, but the framing. The story told about the chemistry, the commercial context in which it is delivered, the institutional authority behind the claim that this particular molecule, this time, is different. Non-addictive. That was the word. Non-addictive. It echoed through prescription pads and medical journals and pharmacy counters, and the reassuring conversations between physicians and the mothers who brought their coughing children for examination. Non-addictive. And so the children received their doses, and the coughing stopped, and the children slept, and the medicine was given again the next night because the coughing returned, and again the night after that, and gradually, weeks passing, months passing, the intervals between doses shortened, and the doses themselves increased, and the children who stopped receiving the syrup became agitated and tearful in ways that their mothers could not explain. The first serious warnings accumulated in the medical literature beginning around 1899, the same year aspirin was launched, the same year Bayer was celebrating its new pharmaceutical triumph in trade catalogues distributed across the world. A German physician published observations of dependency symptoms. Then another. Then reports from American physicians who were seeing patients arrive at their offices, not with the original complaint for which heroin had been prescribed, but with symptoms that looked uncomfortably like the morphine withdrawal they had spent the previous decade trying to address. The substitution of heroin for morphine, it emerged, had not solved the addiction crisis. It had deepened it. The new drug was, if anything, faster to create dependency than the old one, more intensely pleasurable in the initial doses, and more difficult to stop. These reports did not immediately change anything. The commercial infrastructure of heroin distribution was too well established by 1901, 1902, 1903, for a scattering of clinical observations to reverse. Physicians who had prescribed the drug were not eager to believe they had harmed their patients. Patients who had become dependent on the drug were not well positioned to evaluate their own condition objectively. Bayer continued to produce and market heroin through all of this because the commercial incentive to continue was substantial, and the regulatory pressure to stop had not yet materialized. The United States Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required, for the first time, that pharmaceutical products label their contents. This was a significant moment, not because it immediately stopped the distribution of heroin-containing products, but because it meant that for the first time, consumers could see what they were being given. Mothers who picked up a bottle of cough syrup and read the label now encountered the word heroin printed alongside the dosage instructions. Some of them recognized the word from the reports that had begun to circulate in popular press as well as medical journals. Some of them did not. But the label created, for the first time, a space for informed choice that had not existed when the product was simply called a cough remedy and sold on the authority of the physician who recommended it. By the first decade of the 20th century, the heroin crisis was visible enough to be a subject of political concern in several countries. In the United States, the number of people dependent on opioids, morphine, heroin, and the various patent medicines that contained both had grown to a scale that public health officials found alarming. The demographic of addiction had also shifted in ways that made it harder to dismiss. The morphine addicts of the post-Civil War era had been predominantly war veterans, a population whose dependency could be explained by their traumatic experience. The heroin addicts of 1908 and 1910 were housewives and teachers and shopkeepers and children, ordinary people from ordinary households who had been given a drug by their physicians or their chemists on the authority of the company that made it. In 1914, the United States Congress passed the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act. The legislation imposed strict controls on the distribution and sale of opiates and cocaine, effectively ending the era of over-the-counter heroin availability in America. Other countries followed. In 1924, the manufacture of heroin was made entirely illegal in the United States. Bayer had already stopped producing heroin in 1913, not 11 years after the first warnings appeared in the medical literature. Not following a corporate inquiry that concluded the product had been wrongly characterized. Not after a letter to the medical profession acknowledging that the claim of non-addiction had been incorrect. Bayer stopped producing heroin in 1913 because the market for heroin was contracting as regulation tightened, and because the regulatory trajectory was clear enough that continued investment in production made no commercial sense. The decision was a commercial decision. It was made on commercial grounds. The people who remained addicted to the drug Bayer had sold them were not a factor in the calculation. There is a particular quality to this moment that deserves stillness. Sit with it for a moment. Between 1898 and 1913, Bayer sold heroin to the world. It sold it to physicians who prescribed it to their patients. It sold it to pharmacies that stocked it on their shelves. It sold it in forms designed for domestic use, for the household medicine cabinet, for the mother who needed something to quiet a child's cough in the small hours of the morning. It sold it under the explicit claim that it was non-addictive, a claim that the company's own scientists had produced evidence to question within months of the drug's launch, and that the accumulating medical literature had substantially demolished within a decade of that launch. And when the political and regulatory environment made continued production unprofitable, it stopped, and it moved on. The aspirin business in the same period continued to grow. The aspirin patent expired in 1917, and Bayer lost its American trademark, the name aspirin becoming generic, available to any manufacturer. But the product itself, the molecule Hoffmann had stabilized on August 10th, 1897, went on to become exactly what it remains: the most widely used medicine in human history, consumed at a rate of approximately 100 billion tablets per year worldwide. A genuine contribution to human health that has relieved more suffering than almost any other pharmaceutical product ever made. The same company, the same cross, the same laboratory, the same month. One discovery became a global miracle. The other became a global catastrophe, and the company that produced both moved on from the catastrophe without a public reckoning and watched the miracle make it famous. There are lessons in this about institutional accountability, about the architecture of pharmaceutical regulation, about the relationship between commercial incentive and scientific claim. Those lessons are not simple, and they echo forward through the 20th century in ways we will return to. But first, the story must take a turn that makes the heroin episode look, by comparison, like a prelude, because Bayer had not yet discovered what it was truly capable of. The year is 1914. Europe is going to war, and the chemistry that had made Bayer the world's foremost pharmaceutical company was about to be turned toward a purpose that no one who had purchased a bottle of cough syrup in 1901 could have imagined standing in a pharmacy, reading a label, measuring a dose for a child who could not stop coughing. Let us return for a moment to that kitchen, to the brown bottle and the child who stopped coughing. The thing about opioids, and this is worth understanding slowly, because it is the central mechanism of the entire catastrophe, is that they work. That is not a minor detail. It is the source of everything that follows. A child given heroin for a cough does not cough. The medicine achieves exactly what the medicine is supposed to achieve. The child sleeps. The mother sleeps. In the morning there is relief. In the household, in the body, in the relationship between parent and child, that is always strained a little by illness, by the helplessness of watching something hurt that you cannot reach. The medicine worked. The medicine is therefore good. The medicine goes back into the cabinet. What opioids also do, in the same dose, at the same moment, through the same mechanism that suppresses the cough, is begin the process of teaching the body to need them. The reward pathways that light up when the molecule binds to the brain's opioid receptors do not distinguish between therapeutic relief and recreational pleasure. They simply register. This is good. More of this would also be good. The absence of this is bad. The body does not know it is being medicated. It knows only that something has arrived which makes it feel better than it did before, and that this thing can apparently be reliably obtained, and that its absence produces a particular quality of wrongness. For a child in 1901 whose cough has been treated with Bayer heroin syrup over the course of a winter, this process is silent and invisible. The parents see a child who sleeps well when given the medicine and sleeps poorly when it is withheld. They do not see the neurological recalibration occurring behind the child's eyes. They see a treatment that works and its absence causing discomfort, and they draw the obvious conclusion: the child needs the medicine. The medicine is available. They give it. This is not failure of parental care. This is the rational response to a situation that has been deliberately framed to make this response the natural one. The pharmaceutical company provided the frame. The physician endorsed it. The pharmacist stocked the product. The label said, "Cough remedy," and the cough went away. The damage accumulated in silence, over years, in bodies too young to understand what was happening to them, and in households where the concept of pharmaceutical addiction had not yet been given a name that ordinary people could apply to their own experience. It was not until the children were older, not until the dependency had deepened, to the point where the absence of the drug produced symptoms impossible to ignore or explain away, that the shape of what had happened began to be visible to the people living inside it. By then, Bayer had moved on. There is a building in Leverkusen that Bayer does not emphasize in its official corporate history. It was constructed during the First World War on the company's main site, and its purpose was stated without ambiguity in the name given to it by the people who built it. They called it the School for Chemical Warfare. Not a research facility, not a defensive laboratory, not a facility for developing protective equipment or studying the effects of toxic agents on human tissue in order to treat casualties. A school for chemical warfare, a place for training chemists in the systematic development and deployment of chemical agents against human beings on a battlefield. Bayer built it. Bayer staffed it. Bayer's managing director, Karl Duisberg, was among the most enthusiastic advocates for its existence and for the weapons it was designed to produce. This is where the story of Bayer moves from the merely disturbing into something that requires a different vocabulary entirely. The transition from pharmaceutical company to chemical weapons manufacturer was not, it should be said, a violent rupture. It was a logical extension. The same organic chemistry that produced aspirin and heroin, the same industrial infrastructure that had been built to manufacture synthetic dyes and pharmaceuticals at scale, the same research laboratories that had been optimized for the systematic development of new chemical compounds. All of these could be redirected toward the production of toxic agents without any fundamental change to the underlying technology. The chemistry was the chemistry. What changed was the application. And Karl Duisberg understood this more clearly than almost anyone. By 1914, Duisberg had spent 30 years building Bayer into the most powerful pharmaceutical and chemical company in Germany, arguably the most sophisticated chemical operation anywhere in the world. He had watched the company move from dye manufacturing to pharmaceutical development, and in both transitions he had seen the same principle operate, that the value of chemical expertise lies not in any specific product, but in the capacity to produce whatever chemistry can produce. A laboratory that can synthesize a painkiller can, with modest adjustment, synthesize a poison. A factory that can produce cough syrup at industrial scale can, with similar adjustment, produce chlorine gas at industrial scale. The knowledge transfers. The infrastructure transfers. The only thing that changes is intent. When war came in August 1914, Duisberg did not hesitate. He joined a commission of German scientists and industrialists convened to advise the military on the use of chemical agents as weapons. The commission was chaired by Fritz Haber, the brilliant, contradictory chemist who had won the Nobel Prize for his development of a process to synthesize ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen, a discovery that would ultimately feed hundreds of millions of people by enabling artificial fertilizer production, and who would spend the years between 1914 and 1918 directing the weaponization of chemistry against human beings. Haber is perhaps the most extreme embodiment in history of the principle that the value of a scientific discovery is entirely separable from the use to which it is put. He saved the world from famine. He helped industrialize mass killing. Both things are true. Duisberg sat on Haber's commission alongside the physicist Walter Nernst, and together they reviewed proposals for the deployment of chlorine gas against enemy positions. Chlorine was not an exotic compound. It was a byproduct of the dye manufacturing process that Bayer and its competitors, BASF, Hoechst, had been running for decades. The tanks were full of it. The industrial expertise to handle and transport it safely existed throughout the German chemical industry. The question was not whether it could be weaponized. The question was how. The answer they developed was straightforward in its brutality. Chlorine gas is denser than air. It settles into low places, into shell craters, into trenches, into the depressions in ground that soldiers instinctively move toward when they are being fired upon. If released in sufficient quantity from upwind positions, it would flow across no man's land and descend into the Allied trenches before the men sheltering there had time to respond. It would fill the spaces where they breathed. It would destroy the tissue of their airways. It would kill some of them and incapacitate many more. This proposal violated the Hague Convention respecting the laws and customs of war on land, signed in 1907, under which the use of chemical warfare had been explicitly banned. The Commission was aware of this. They proceeded anyway. Carl Duisberg observed the early tests of chlorine gas with something that the historical record suggests was enthusiasm rather than ambivalence. His assessment, preserved in documented accounts, was clinical and precise. The enemy, he noted, would not know when an area had been treated with the gas, and would remain quietly in place until the consequences arrived. This was offered as a military advantage. The inability of soldiers to detect that they were being poisoned until the poison had already done its work was, in Duisberg's assessment, a feature. He was, in 1914, the same man who had spent the previous decade building the world's most trusted pharmaceutical brand. He was also the man who had authorized the development and global distribution of heroin under the claim that it was non-addictive. These facts do not contradict each other. They are consistent expressions of the same underlying disposition, the disposition of a man who understood chemistry as a tool for achieving outcomes and who evaluated outcomes primarily in terms of their commercial or strategic value rather than their human consequences. In the spring of 1915, Bayer supplied approximately 700 tons of chemicals to the German military. On the 22nd day of April 1915, at a small Belgian town called Ypres, the German army released approximately 170 tons of chlorine gas from 6,000 cylinders dug into the earth along a 4-mile front. The gas drifted south-southwest on the afternoon breeze, a visible greenish-yellow cloud moving at the pace of the wind across the cratered ground of no man's land toward the French and Algerian and Canadian troops positioned in the Allied trenches. The soldiers who saw it coming did not know what it was. Nothing like it had been used on a battlefield before. Some of them, the accounts suggest, thought it might be a smokescreen, a diversion for a conventional infantry advance. By the time the cloud reached the trench line, they were already breathing it. chlorine gas reacts with the moisture of the airways to form hydrochloric acid. In the lungs, in the bronchioles, in the tissue of the throat, and the passages that carry air to the blood. It does not produce immediate unconsciousness. It produces burning, an escalating drowning sensation as the airways fill with fluid produced by the chemical reaction occurring inside them. The soldiers at Ypres who survived described it as drowning on dry land, the sensation of the lungs filling from the inside, the body suffocating not from the absence of air, but from the destruction of its capacity to use it. 10,000 Allied soldiers were affected in that first attack. Around 1,000 died, most of them in the hours and days immediately following, as the fluid in their lungs completed the damage that the gas had begun. The survivors described symptoms that persisted for years. A chronic fragility of the airways, a susceptibility to respiratory illness, a body that had been altered at the level of its tissue by an experience it was never designed to survive. The German High Command considered the attack a partial success. The initial advance it was intended to support failed to achieve its objectives. The Allied line held, partly because the attacking infantry had not been prepared to exploit a breakthrough of this magnitude, partly because the gas cloud eventually dispersed, partly because the shock of the attack had not, as hoped, produced a complete collapse of the defensive position. But the principle had been demonstrated. Chemistry could be weaponized at scale. The industrial expertise of Bayer and BASF and Hoechst, the decades of organic chemistry research, the massive production infrastructure built to manufacture dyes and pharmaceuticals. All of it could be turned, and had now been turned, toward the systematic killing of human beings in quantities that conventional weapons alone could not achieve. What followed was escalation. The chemistry of war developed the same way that the chemistry of medicine had developed. Iteratively, systematically, each new compound an improvement on the last. After chlorine came phosgene, a more lethal agent contained in the shells the German army color-coded green. Phosgene was responsible for the majority of gas-related deaths in the First World War. More lethal than chlorine, more insidious. Its effects delayed for up to 48 hours, so that soldiers who felt relatively well after exposure would develop fatal pulmonary edema while apparently recovering. Bayer was a major supplier of phosgene and of the intermediary chemicals required to produce it. After phosgene came mustard gas. Introduced by Germany in July 1917, mustard gas, coded yellow, was not primarily a killing agent. It was a disabling agent, designed to persist in the environment and create casualties at a rate that would overwhelm medical services, strip the battlefield of fighting capacity, and contaminate ground so thoroughly that it remained unusable for weeks. It blistered skin, destroyed eyes, inflamed airways. A soldier exposed to mustard gas might survive but be incapacitated for months, requiring intensive medical care, representing a far greater drain on military resources than a soldier who had simply been killed. The tactical innovation of the Blue Cross shells, containing compounds designed to cause violent vomiting, that forced soldiers to remove their gas masks, leaving them unprotected when chlorine or phosgene was released simultaneously, was also developed in this period in the chemical warfare research that Bayer and its peers were conducting in cooperation with the German military. The chemistry of suffering was being optimized. Each new formulation was an improvement on the last. The scientists brought to this work the same methodical rigor, the same iterative discipline, the same commitment to systematic improvement that they brought to pharmaceutical research. At the Leverkusen headquarters, the School for Chemical Warfare trained chemists in these methods and their applications. The institution was not, to be precise, staffed exclusively by Bayer employees. It drew on expertise from across the German chemical industry, and its work was coordinated with Haber's broader military chemistry program. But it sat on Bayer's site. It operated under Bayer's aegis. It was an expression of Bayer's institutional commitment to the German war effort, a commitment that Duisburg had championed and that the company had delivered on with the same efficiency it brought to everything else it did. The war ended in November 1918 with Germany's defeat. The chemical weapons program ceased. The School for Chemical Warfare closed. But Duisburg had a plan. He had been developing it for years, through the war and before it. A plan that would consolidate the German chemical industry into a single structure so large, so integrated, so dominant that no competitor anywhere in the world could challenge it. A structure that would make Bayer and BASF and Höchst and the Tatsandeisi others collectively invulnerable to the economic consequences of Germany's defeat. He had been calling it, in his private correspondence, the Great Consolidation. In 1925, he achieved it. The result was called IG Farben, and IG Farben would make everything that had come before, the heroin, the gas attacks, the School for Chemical Warfare, look in retrospect like prologue. Let us stay with Ypres for a moment longer, with the men in the trenches. The soldiers at the front in April 1915 were not, in the main, professional soldiers. They were men who had been farmers and school teachers and factory workers and shopkeepers 6 months earlier, who had enlisted or been conscripted into a war that none of them had entirely understood when it began, who were living in conditions of physical misery that exceeded almost anything that the civilian life they had left behind had prepared them for. They had already survived months of artillery bombardment, of machine gun fire, of the accumulated attrition of trench warfare that was turning the fields of Belgium and northern France into a landscape without precedent in human history. They were tired, they were cold, many of them were ill. And now, on the afternoon of April 22nd, they watched a greenish-yellow cloud drifting toward them across the mud, and they did not know what it was. There is a particular quality to that not knowing. The men at Ypres, in the first minutes after the gas was released, were encountering something for which there was no framework, no precedent, no category in their experience that would allow them to properly assess the danger. They had learned, in the months of war, to interpret a landscape of danger, to read the arc of a shell, to understand the sound of incoming fire, to recognize the signs that an infantry advance was coming. None of that training helped them with the cloud. The cloud was silent. It had no trajectory. It moved at the speed of the wind, and it settled into the low places where they were sheltering. By the time the burning began, it was already too late for most of them to outrun it. The company whose product descended into those trenches had 12 years earlier been selling heroin cough syrup to the mothers of Europe as a remedy for children's respiratory complaints. The irony is so complete, so geometrically precise, that it almost resists belief. The same Bayer cross that had appeared on the bottles of medicine designed to soothe inflamed airways now appeared, through the chain of production, supply, and deployment, on the chemicals being used to destroy airways in the most violent manner organic chemistry could achieve. The comfort of the nursery and the horror of the trench, connected by the same company, the same infrastructure, the same institutional logic of chemistry, applied without constraint to whatever purpose presented itself. Duisberg's enthusiasm for the gas program was not, it should be noted, unique among German industrialists of the period. The war created powerful incentives, financial, patriotic, and institutional, for Germany's chemical companies to contribute their expertise to the military effort, and most of them did so without evident moral hesitation. But Duisberg was not merely compliant, he was a proponent. He attended gas tests personally. He corresponded with Haber in terms that made clear he considered chemical weapons a genuine military innovation worth developing with the same rigor and ambition that he brought to pharmaceutical research. His remark about phosgene, that it was the meanest weapon he knew, and that this was a reason to use it rather than a reason to hesitate, was made not in private anguish, but in the context of an enthusiastic public recommendation. He was 63 years old when the war ended. He had spent the previous 4 years helping to direct the most intensive chemical weapons program in history. He was also the man who had built the world's foremost pharmaceutical company, who had championed aspirin and overseen the development of dozens of medicines that genuinely helped people, who had created in Bayer an institution that was, by any conventional measure, one of the great achievements of applied science in the industrial era. He held both of these identities simultaneously. He did not appear to find them contradictory. This, more than any specific atrocity, is perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Bayer story, not the specific crimes. Though the crimes were real, and they will grow considerably darker before this history is complete, but the absolute untroubled ease with which the same institution, the same leadership, the same infrastructure moved between healing and killing, between the relief of suffering and its systematic creation. The pharmaceutical company and the chemical weapons manufacturer were not two different entities. They were the same entity, operating at different moments, in different contexts, with the same tools. The tools do not care what they build. On the 2nd day of December, 1925, in Frankfurt, Germany, 6 chemical companies signed the documents that merged them into a single entity. The companies were Bayer, BASF, Höchst, Agfa, Griesheim Elektron, and Weiler Thermea. The entity they created was called Interessengemeinschaft Farben Industrie Aktiengesellschaft, the community of interests of the dye industry, known to history by its abbreviation, IG Farben. What emerged from that signing was the largest company in Germany, the largest chemical company in the world, the largest single corporation in Europe. At its peak, it would employ 330,000 people. Its revenues exceeded those of most sovereign states. It held patents on substances that the global economy depended upon. It produced synthetic rubber, synthetic fuel, explosives, pharmaceuticals, dyes, photographic equipment, and the industrial chemicals that underpin almost every form of modern manufacturing. It was, in the language of the period, a trust, a consolidation of previously competing interests into a single structure so large and so integrated that it operated beyond the ordinary mechanisms of market competition. Karl Duisberg had spent 2 decades pursuing this consolidation. He became IG Farben's first chairman. He was 64 years old. The merger made immediate commercial sense. Germany had lost the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the German chemical industry of many of its foreign patents, imposed reparations that drained capital from industrial investment, and created the conditions for the hyperinflation of the early 1920s that had made ordinary economic planning nearly impossible. Consolidation offered efficiency, shared resources, reduced competition, and the combined lobbying weight of an industrial entity large enough to be impossible to ignore. Duisberg had argued for it on these grounds for years, and the post-war economic catastrophe had made his argument unanswerable. What Duisberg may not have fully anticipated, or what he perhaps anticipated more clearly than he acknowledged, was the political use to which a consolidated industrial giant of this magnitude could be put by a sufficiently determined political movement. In the years following the merger, as Germany's Weimar Republic staggered through its final convulsions and the National Socialist German Workers' Party consolidated its position as the primary vehicle of German nationalist politics, IG Farben found itself in a relationship with Adolf Hitler that began as transactional and became catastrophic. The relationship was not forced upon IG Farben. This is important to establish clearly. In the decisive years before Hitler came to power, IG Farben became the single largest private donor to Hitler's election campaign. In the year before the 1933 elections that consolidated Nazi power, IG Farben contributed 400,000 marks to the Nazi Party. The company's board had reservations. Some of its most prominent scientists were Jewish, and the Nazi Party's anti-Semitism was not a secret. But the calculation that the board made was a familiar one in the history of industrial collaboration with authoritarian movements. Hitler had promised to support the company's synthetic gasoline program. He had promised stability. He had promised a restoration of German industrial strength. The investment, the board concluded, was worth making. It paid off beyond any ordinary business calculation. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, IG Farben became the German state's most important industrial partner. The company's synthetic fuel program, Luna, received the government support that had been promised. IG Farben produced all of the explosives used by the German military. It developed and manufactured the synthetic rubber and synthetic fuel that made the German war machine possible in a country that lacked natural petroleum reserves. It systematically seized the chemical plants of occupied countries as the Wehrmacht advanced across Europe, absorbing the industrial infrastructure of Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the other occupied territories into its own structure. It looted, it expanded, it grew on the wreckage of the countries the German military had destroyed. And then it did something else. In 1941, IG Farben began construction of a factory near a small town in occupied southern Poland. The factory was designed to produce Buna, synthetic rubber, and synthetic fuel for the German war effort. It was a massive installation. The company invested 600 million Reichsmarks of its own money in the project. It was, at completion, the largest private industrial complex ever built, consuming at its peak more electricity than the entire city of Berlin. The factory was built next to a concentration camp. The camp was called Auschwitz. The location was not accidental. IG Farben's executives selected the Auschwitz site precisely because of its proximity to the camp, because the camp provided access to a labor supply that cost nothing. The company negotiated with the SS for access to concentration camp prisoners who were marched to the construction site each day and put to work. They were paid nothing. They were fed less than a human body requires to sustain itself through heavy physical labor. When they became too sick or too weak to work, They were returned to the camp and replaced with others. Between 1941 and 1945, approximately 25,000 to 35,000 concentration camp prisoners worked at the E.G. Farben plant at Auschwitz. The mortality rate was extreme. Life expectancy for a prisoner assigned to the Buna construction site was, by conservative estimates, a matter of months. The work was brutal, pouring concrete in winter, laying rail lines across waterlogged ground, constructing industrial buildings in conditions that would have been physically punishing even for well-fed workers, inadequate clothing. For prisoners who were being systematically starved, who had been transported to Auschwitz in conditions that had already broken many of them, who had no medical care and no rest and no recourse of any kind, the work was often fatal. In 1942, I.G. Farben constructed its own concentration camp adjacent to the Buna plant. They called it Monowitz, or Auschwitz III. The camp was built by the SS in collaboration with I.G. Farben executives, designed specifically to house the workers the company needed for its factory. The company negotiated the terms of the camp with the SS. The company paid the SS a daily fee per prisoner, which covered, in the company's accounting, the cost of the prisoners' housing, feeding, and guarding. The prisoners received none of this payment. They received a starvation ration and were worked until they were no longer useful, at which point they were transferred back to Birkenau. One I.G. Farben board member responsible for the Auschwitz project, Otto Armbrust, wrote to his colleagues in 1941 with an assessment of the arrangement that captures something essential about the moral atmosphere in which these decisions were made. "Our new friendship with the SS is a blessing," he wrote. He meant it as a business observation. Now we must speak of Zyklon B. E.G. Farben held the patent through its subsidiary Dagesh, the German Society for Pest Control, on a cyanide-based pesticide that had been developed in the 1920s for agricultural use. The compound was hydrogen cyanide, stabilized with a carrier material and packaged in pellet form. It was sold under the trade name Zyklon B. When the pellets were exposed to air, they released hydrogen cyanide gas. The gas was lethal to insects at low concentrations. It was lethal to human beings at higher ones. The Nazi administration, beginning in 1941, began using Zyklon B to murder prisoners in the gas chambers of the concentration camp system. The compound was ordered, shipped, and delivered through I.G. Farben's subsidiary. The form of Zyklon B, supplied for use in the gas chambers, was deliberately modified from the commercial agricultural product. The normal safety odorant, the chemical signal added to the pellets to warn human beings of the presence of a lethal gas, was removed. The version of Zyklon B delivered to Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Majdanek was designed to kill without warning. Over 1,100,000 people, the vast majority of them Jewish, were murdered with Zyklon B at Auschwitz-Birkenau alone. I.G. Farben also supplied the SS with the methanol used to burn the corpses. The medical experimentation conducted at Auschwitz included experiments using pharmaceuticals and biological agents supplied by what had formerly been Bayer's Pharmaceutical division, now operating within the I.G. Farben structure. Bayer Pharmaceuticals and infectious agents, tuberculosis bacteria, diphtheria organisms, were tested on prisoners who had been deliberately infected. A physician named Vetter, employed by I.G. Farben, conducted these experiments in the women's camp at Birkenau in Block 20, working alongside Auschwitz physicians, including the man who would become known to history as the angel of death. The prisoners who were used in these experiments had not consented. They had no mechanism by which they could refuse. They were, in the clinical language of the IG Farben laboratory records that survived the war, subjects. At the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal in 1946, the chief prosecutor Telford Taylor made an assessment of IG Farben's role in the war that the court ultimately endorsed. Without IG Farben, the Second World War would simply not have been possible. The company had provided the synthetic fuel and rubber, without which the German military could not have sustained its campaigns. It had provided the explosives. It had looted the chemical industries of occupied Europe. It had used slave labor at a scale that qualified, under any reasonable definition, as a crime against humanity. And it had, through its subsidiary, supplied the agent used to murder over 1 million people. 24 IG Farben board members and executives were indicted on charges of crimes against humanity. 13 received prison sentences. Telford Taylor's description of those sentences is one of the more restrained pieces of sustained sarcasm in the legal record of the 20th century. They were, he said, light enough to please a chicken thief. Among those convicted was a man named Fritz Termeer. Termeer had joined IG Farben's board in 1925, the year of its formation, and had risen to become chairman of its technical committee and the most senior scientist on its supervisory board. He had been a Nazi Party member since 1937. He was the executive responsible for the construction of the IG Farben factory at Auschwitz. The man who had overseen, from the corporate side, the project in which tens of thousands of human beings had been worked to death in service of a rubber and fuel program. At the Nuremberg IG Farben trial in July 1948, Fritz Termeer was convicted of plunder, enslavement, and mass murder. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. During his testimony, he was asked about the suffering of the slave laborers at the Auschwitz plant. His response was recorded. No specific suffering, he maintained, had been inflicted on the laborers. Because without this, without the work, without the camp, they would have been killed anyway. He served 5 years of his 7-year sentence. He was released in 1950. 6 years later, in 1956, Fritz Termeer was elected chairman of the supervisory board of Bayer AG. He held the position until 1964. After his death in 1967, Bayer named a student support foundation in his honor. The foundation was later quietly renamed. Let us stay with Termeer's sentence for a moment. 7 years for mass murder, for enslavement, for the construction of a camp in which, by conservative estimate, at least 25,000 people died. 7 years. He walked out of Landsberg prison in 1950 at 65 years old into a West Germany that was in the early stages of its economic reconstruction and was not, in the immediate post-war period, particularly interested in dwelling on the mechanisms by which the Nazi state had functioned. The Cold War had begun. American occupation policy had shifted from denazification to reconstruction. The executives who had been tried at Nuremberg, those who had received sentences, those who had been acquitted, those who had never been charged, were returning to the industries they had built because those industries were needed. The German chemical companies were among the most technically sophisticated in the world, and the world in 1950 needed their technical sophistication. Bayer was reconstituted as an independent company in 1951, separated from the dissolved IG Farben conglomerate. along with BASF and Höchst. It was called Farben Fabriken Bayer Aktiengesellschaft. The Bayer cross was restored to its packaging. The company began again. And then, in 1956, it elected Fritz Termier to chair its supervisory board. This was not an oversight. It was not an accident of bureaucratic inertia or a failure of institutional memory. The men who voted to place a convicted war criminal, a man found guilty of mass murder at the Nuremberg military tribunals, at the head of the company's governing body, did so with full knowledge of who he was and what he had done. They elected him anyway. He served until 1964. He was in his 80s when he left the position. There is something to be said here about the Eichengrün thread, the loop that was opened in the second chapter of this story and has been waiting through everything that followed to be closed. Arthur Eichengrün, the chemist who may have directed the synthesis of aspirin, the Jewish employee whose contribution was erased from Bayer's records when the Nazi government came to power. He was 77 years old in 1944 when the Gestapo came for him. He was sent to Theresienstadt concentration camp, the camp in what is now the Czech Republic, that the Nazis used as a model camp, a Potemkin institution they showed to the International Red Cross as evidence of humane treatment, while its inmates died of disease and starvation at a steady and deliberate rate. Eichengrün survived. He was liberated in 1945. He returned to Germany. He was 77 years old, and he had survived a concentration camp. And he sat down and wrote his account of the discovery of aspirin, the account that Bayer had suppressed for decades. And he published it in a scientific journal in 1949. He died the same year. Bayer's official record of aspirin's discovery did not change. The company continued to attribute the synthesis to Felix Hoffmann alone. It was not until a researcher at the University of Strathclyde published a formal analysis in the British Medical Journal in 2000, more than 50 years after Eichengrün's account appeared, that the question received serious historical attention. Bayer has never formally acknowledged Eichengrün's contribution. The cross on the aspirin packet has never changed. It was registered as Bayer's trademark in 1904, and it has appeared on every Bayer product in the century and more since then. It appeared on the bottles of heroin sold to mothers in 1901. It appeared on the documents authorizing the Auschwitz factory construction. It appeared on the aspirin centenary celebrations in 1999, when Bayer wrapped its Leverkusen headquarters in the world's largest aspirin packet and invited the world to celebrate 100 years of healing. One cross. Many histories. There is a question that this history eventually forces you to sit with, and it does not have a clean answer. The question is this: what does it mean that the same company is responsible for all of it? Not two companies, not a family of related institutions that diverged over time. One company, one cross, one unbroken institutional thread connecting the dye shop in Barmen in 1863 to the heroin distributed to children in 1901, to the chlorine released at Ypres in 1915, to the slave labor at Auschwitz in 1943, to the aspirin in your medicine cabinet tonight. Bayer's official position, when this history is raised, has been to draw a legal distinction. Between 1925 and 1952, the company points out, no entity named Bayer legally existed. The company was dissolved into IG Farben in 1925. IG Farben committed the crimes. IG Farben was dissolved by the Allies in 1945, and its assets distributed. What emerged in 1951 was a new company, Farben Fabriken Bayer Aktiengesellschaft, that bore the name but not in. The company's reading, the moral inheritance of what had been done in the decades before. This is a legal argument. It is not a moral one. The shareholders of Farben Fabriken Bayer Aktiengesellschaft in 1951 were the shareholders of E.G. Farben. The executives who led Bayer's reconstruction were, in significant number, the same men who had led the institution through the war. The scientists who staffed the newly independent company's laboratories had worked in those same laboratories through the years of slave labor and medical experimentation. The institutional memory, the technical expertise, the corporate culture, the physical buildings, all of these were continuous. What changed in 1951 was a legal structure, not a human community. And then, as if to make the point with maximum clarity, the reconstituted company elected Fritz Termeer to chair its supervisory board. The Nuremberg trials produced one unambiguous gift to history that emerged directly from the crimes committed under I.G. Farben's aegis. The I.G. Farben trial was one of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg military tribunals, and it sat alongside the Nuremberg doctors' trial, the proceeding that examined the medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners, including those using pharmaceuticals supplied by what had been Bayer's research division. From the doctors' trial emerged the Nuremberg Code, a set of principles governing the conduct of medical research that remain foundational to bioethics today. The first and most fundamental principle is the requirement of voluntary informed consent, the principle that no human being may be subjected to medical experimentation without their free and informed agreement. The Nuremberg Code exists because Bayer Pharmaceuticals were tested on prisoners at Auschwitz who had no capacity to refuse. The relationship between the crime and the principle that the crime produced is one of the more painful ironies available to anyone studying this history. The most important ethical framework governing pharmaceutical research in the modern world was written in direct response to the actions of a company that is still selling medicine. By the 1970s, Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst, the three major companies that had emerged from I.G. Farben's dissolution, had returned to economic dominance. They were among the largest companies in West Germany. They contributed to the Federal Republic's extraordinary post-war recovery, the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed a country destroyed by war into one of the world's leading industrial powers within a generation. The chemical and pharmaceutical expertise that had been built over a century, that had survived the war and the dissolution and the trials, was the foundation of that recovery. The knowledge did not disappear with the crimes. It was rebuilt, re-employed, rebranded. In 1972, the company officially adopted the name Bayer AG. The cross remained. In 1994, Bayer regained the rights to its name and trademark in the United States. Rights it had lost in 1919 when its American assets were seized as enemy property after the First World War. For the first time in 75 years, Bayer could operate in America under its own name, with its own cross, as the company it had always been. The aspirin market it re-entered was one it had created nearly a century earlier. In 1999, on the 6th of March, Bayer celebrated the centenary of aspirin. The company marked the occasion by wrapping the exterior of its former high-rise headquarters building in Leverkusen, a striking piece of modernist architecture, in the world's largest aspirin packet. The Bayer cross, reproduced at enormous scale, glowed against the German winter sky. The celebration was a genuine one. Aspirin, by 1999, had accumulated a century of achievements that justified celebration. It had been discovered in the decades since its launch to have cardiovascular benefits its inventors could not have imagined. The ability to reduce the risk of heart attack and stroke through its effects on blood clotting. Millions of people were taking it daily, not for headaches, but for their hearts. The compound that Felix Hoffmann had stabilized in the Elberfeld laboratory on the 10th of August, 1897, was, by 1999, one of the most thoroughly studied and broadly beneficial medicines in human history. 100 billion tablets consumed annually worldwide. More aspirin used every year than any other medicine on earth. The Bayer cross on every packet. The cross that was also on the heroin bottles. The cross that appeared on IG Farben, correspondence regarding the Auschwitz factory. The cross that Fritz der Meer carried back to the chairman's office in 1956 without, as far as any public record shows, any expression of remorse for what had been done beneath it. There is a pattern that runs through the 20th century and into the 21st that this history illuminates with uncomfortable clarity. The pharmaceutical company that markets an addictive opioid as safe and non-addictive, that profits from its distribution until regulation makes the market unprofitable, that withdraws from the market without formal accountability and moves on. This pattern did not end with Bayer's heroin in 1913. It recurred with almost architectural precision in the opioid crisis that began in the 1990s with the marketing of OxyContin as a painkiller with low potential for abuse, a claim made in 1996 with the same confidence that Dresser had brought to the Congress of German naturalists and physicians in 1898. The language was nearly identical. The mechanism was identical. The outcome was identical. The accountability was, as before, attenuated by legal structures that made it possible for institutions to absorb liability without ever producing a full reckoning with what had been done. Bayer did not make OxyContin, but the template was theirs, the original. What then do we make of the cross? It is, in the end, a symbol, and symbols mean what history gives them to mean, which is to say they mean many things simultaneously, and the meanings do not resolve into each other. And the discomfort of holding them together is the price of looking clearly. The Bayer cross means aspirin, which means relief, which means the headache that faded, and the fever that broke, and the heart attack that did not happen, because the daily low-dose tablet was taken faithfully for 20 years. These are real. They are not small. The Bayer cross also means heroin in a children's cough bottle. It means chlorine released at Ypres. It means the Auschwitz Buna plant and the slave laborers who built it and died in it. It means Fritz der Meer in the chairman's office. It means Arthur Eichengrün in Theresienstadt, writing an account that the company never acknowledged. The cross has not changed. It is the same circle, the same 5 letters, the same geometry that was registered as a trademark in 1904 and has appeared on Bayer's products in every country on earth in every year since. The company did not alter it after the war. It did not retire it or redesign it, or make any visible gesture toward distinguishing the institution that emerged from Auschwitz IG Farben's dissolution from the institution that had entered it. The cross remained because the cross was the brand, and the brand was valuable, and the value of the brand was built on aspirin, and aspirin was genuinely good, and genuine goodness, it turns out, is remarkably durable even when it shares a logo with atrocity. This is, perhaps, the most unsettling truth that this history offers. Not that evil institutions exist, they do, and they can sometimes be identified and opposed and dismantled, but that the same institution can produce genuine good and genuine evil in alternating chapters, that the infrastructure of healing and the infrastructure of harm can be identical, that the same laboratory, the same cross, the same institutional continuity can encompass aspirin and heroin and Zyklon B and the Nuremberg Code and a centenary celebration and a convicted war criminal in the chairman's office. That all of this is possible without the institution ever ceasing to exist, ever being held to a reckoning proportionate to what it did, ever being required to account for itself in a way that cost it more than a legal fee and a quiet foundation rename. Bayer is still there, in Leverkusen, employing nearly 100,000 people, selling medicine in more than 100 countries. The aspirin is still the most trusted in the world. The cross is still on the packet. The notebook is still in the archive. The handwriting is still careful. The entries for August 10th and August 21st are still on facing pages, in the same ink, in the same hand, as though they were the same thing. They were, and they weren't. And somewhere in the distance between those two facts lies the entire history of Bayer. The company that gave the world its most trusted medicine and its most destructive narcotic, that soothed children's coughs and gassed soldiers in Belgian trenches, that built a factory at Auschwitz and a school for chemical warfare, and when the war was over, returned to making aspirin. Good evening and good night.